control over. We have and very much promote software purchases throughout the city, to explore efficiencies and become more efficient in your job. Typically, the department that is purchasing it will buy it initially, and with that includes 1 year of software maintenance. It's set up where the IT department funds that software maintenance in all subsequent years. So when we had the in-squad video taping in the squads, and the $10,000 of maintenance that is a year, we have to now budget for some of these things, and this is the increase in that fund, or in that the increase in fees for service is directly related to those increases, and then also budgeting for the recodification and some of the new services that we look to have in 2011 here. And then the last one that I want to touch on real quickly is we see not necessarily an increase in commodities, but there's some funds in there that's a high priority for us, is replacing some of our core networking equipment here at City Hall that everybody connects back to the servers through, and then also the server hardware that runs our virtualization environment, our virtual environment. Both of those pieces of equipment, or those 5 pieces of equipment, are going on about 4 or 5 years old. We'd be proactively replacing those because they don't get much higher than that as far as priority goes for the IT department. They are pretty much the most important devices that we have here at the city. So we would look to replace those in 2012. If we were required to make some cuts, which we aren't at this point, we would probably look to postpone one of those projects until the following year. But with that being said, that is a brief look at the IT budget for 2012. It's very similar except for those couple of items. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have.
So on your one slide, Michael, it appeared then we're looking at around a $10,000 increase. Did I see that right?
Correct.
Okay. John?
Couple questions. First one, in the past there have been passing comments about open source options. Is there any effort to consider and look at open source options when these departments look to buy things for their use? Is there any chance of I mean, I realize there are numerous issues in some cases in open source software, and in some cases it may not help a whole lot to use something like OpenOffice if you've already got your basic Office suite coming more or less free with hardware or things like that. But what's the status of that?
I'm glad you brought that up. Most of the software applications that I was speaking of are fairly specific to the departments. We use PD, for example. To my knowledge, there's not a lot of open source applications out there for those. But we are continuing. As a matter of fact, I just talked with Mr. Heiser from Roseville this past week. We were comparing what we were spending on Civic Plus, which is our vendor for our website. And now, mind you, I'm very happy with our website right now. But to look at that, because there are very kind of becoming standard open source applications, whether it's, you'll laugh at these, but Joomla or Drupal, two very common open source websites, or website, I guess, technologies that are basically free. And so we continue to look at those as, if we were to go out and do it, we probably wouldn't see the cost savings necessarily, or wouldn't be necessarily worthwhile. But again, if we combined all of the various websites for the northeast suburbs, that's a potential savings of hundreds of thousands of dollars, to a point where we could almost hire somebody to come in, do this for us, and in turn save money as well. So we are continuing to look at that. OpenOffice is the same exact thing. When we look to upgrade, we're at 2007 right now. They've got 2010 out and another one coming very soon. At some point we're going to have to make a decision about that, and that's another very likely solution, because I'd say 95% of our users use about 5% of what Office's true power. So there are some definitely cost-saving options there.
Yeah, and obviously you have to have some more hands-on, training and helping people adapt to something like OpenOffice, where it defaults to a different format than Word and stuff like that. But that could save a lot of money in the long run.
The idea is that if instead of spending $50,000 on a software replacement and spend $20,000 to have that training, you still see,
Right.
So.
A general question about the video streaming. I'm just wondering where it's accounted for, so the video streaming of our meetings is effectively paid for as a reduction in the money that we get from the Cable Commission. Do we simply account for it on the revenue side of reduced revenues, or do we have that either in the IT budget or in the legislative budget as a revenue and expenditure that cancels out budget-wise?
I believe it's a reduction in the funds that we get back from them. I believe that goes right into the general fund, but I believe it's a revenue to the general fund.
Mayor and Council, it's exactly that. It is, we count it as revenue, and then the expenditure is part of the City Council budget.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that that was there, because I think that for good accounting, we'd want to make sure that it is on both sides of the balance sheet, because in theory, somebody in the future might decide that they want to compare cost or cut it or something like that, and it's good to have that number there. And then the last question I had was just about you were mentioning the virtualization servers and some of the network architecture here. How you said are there 5 virtualization servers currently, and they're 4 or 5 years old, and do they all? Are you think they're all nearing the ends of their lives, or? We
currently have 3 hosts,
okay.
So 3 virtual servers, 3 hosts, and we run VMware. And VMware, one of the recommendations is that all of your hosts run the same hardware, so they're all purchased at the same time. And I believe it was 4 years ago, so in 2012 we'd be going into the 5th year. And the goal would be to replace all 5 of them, correct? I'm sorry, 3 of them, all 3 of them.
All 3 of them. So would you say that you've run into any, is it a matter of just an age of hardware that you don't want to run into problems, or do you think that you're running into a ceiling in terms of performance relative to the demand that's put on them?
Sure. The decision being made mostly simply because of the importance of those servers, not necessarily that we're running into performance issues. We have had to do hardware upgrades to them over the last couple of years so that we wouldn't reach that ceiling. But it's the decision is being made specifically so we do it prior to having any hardware issues, because they run 85% of our servers, our server platforms. So it's something that it'll let me sleep better at night.
Very understandable. And certainly I've dealt with the server outage thing while you're waiting for some antique part to arrive to get your access back on. So the plan then is to replace all 3 at once, and obviously given that age of hardware, it probably is not worth a whole lot, simply because computers depreciate so quickly. Have you considered an option of acquiring a 4th, almost like a RAID system, where you had a 4th server that could be brought online and would be the same hardware specs and would cost a tiny fraction and maybe give you peace of mind while stretching out the system for another year and a half?
Effectively, the 3rd host is that. So we could effectively run all of our virtual servers on 2 hosts. The downside to that then is that if one of those 2 fails, you don't have enough of those 2.
But of course, if you bought a 4th, then you'd have double redundancy then.
Correct. It comes down to licensing also. The VMware licenses by processor. So if you get a dual processor, doesn't license by, this is more information you probably want to know, doesn't license by cores, but it licenses by processor, and we get dual processors for redundancy in those machines. So there would be a licensing cost there to get a 4th, even though it would just be sitting there dormant until you need it. And in order to truly have it be as, I guess, redundant as what we would want it, we would not want to have it just sit there not having VMware installed on it or anything. We'd want to be able to power it up right away, or have it automatically power on, and then have them all transferred over automatically, and that would require it to be licensed. So, long story short, we would continue to use those servers because they are very, very good machines. We would just roll them back off of maybe our tier 1, I guess, level of importance and move it back to a less important type of application.
But in terms of the bottom line of the cost of buying a 4th machine and the licensing, is the licensing expense so high that it's cheaper to just upgrade all 3 than to have that double redundancy thing as an option? Or
I would have to look again exactly at the exact licensing costs, but we're talking about hardware. Because our hardware costs have been reduced, I mean, our servers, I don't even need to bring them to council because they're
so
under $5,000 per server, whereas the licensing, if memory serves me right, for 2 processors is close to, I believe, $7,000 to $8,000. So, you know, when we're talking about the importance of the 3 machines relative to the cost, total project cost for those 3 machines is probably less than $15,000.
Okay.
So that's where we saw it. The reward for what you're spending is very much worth it in terms of the city and what we would lose on, say, Eden systems going down for even 1 day.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you're good with all of that then?
Yeah.
Because I have no idea what you're talking about. And so, Jim?
Just a quick question, Michael. You know, just full disclosure, part of the way I currently make a living outside of the wonderful pay at City Council is we work with both municipalities and independent organizations to really do that assessment of the infrastructure within any organization and kind of, you know, where we're at. So from the city's perspective, and you know, we did 7 municipalities now, and it's a total full IT assessment. So part of the discovery, of course, is looking at your infrastructure, your servers, their age and performance levels and things like that. Have we ever done that? Has the city ever had either an internal assessment or an outside party assessment? And the reason I ask it, not for personal gain, is but to understand, you know, what there is to be gained by it. In other words, our core business operating systems are on our oldest servers. Well, that's a flaw, right? And where's our security leaks and those sort of pieces like that. So have we done anything like that in recently?
We haven't. We've never had an outside party come in and do it, and have a, you know, an unbiased, I guess, blanket look at our systems. We do it informally, basically every year. We go through and say, because it helps me sleep at night, to be able to go through and say, all right, this is aging, this isn't, what's, you know, our next, it usually centers around budget talks. So we'll sit down with my staff and we'll go through potential projects that we see coming up this year, and then potential replacements that are needed. Nick Franzen, who is our systems analyst, we speak quite a bit about, you know, what he sees as future needs in certain areas. The other thing, though, that I think you're talking about is a lot of processes also, and that's one area where we haven't spent a lot of time in recent years whatsoever, because we're much more reactive than proactive, and we'd like to get back again with the addition of the IT technician to where we can go around to the different departments, spend some time both looking at their hardware, both looking at their software and saying, you know, you can do this a lot more efficient. I think that's kind of what you're talking about a little bit, is to look at those processes and see how it can either be more automated or, you know, just done better in general.
Mm-hmm.
I lost track. Did you finish your presentation? I think you did.
I did.
And then we were in the questions. And
should we wake you in a minute?
and so, are there any other questions? Yeah, and so, Mr. All, it doesn't appear that on page 10, I think you said this before, there's not a category for IT.
I apologize, Council, on page 10. If you would like to cut or increase the IT budget, I certainly could add another line for you. At this point in time, our recommendation is to make no changes to IT, and so we didn't include that.
And so, I want to make sure I understand, because I'm thinking Michael is asking for a small increase, but the recommendation is that we don't do that?
No, the recommendation is to approve his increase as proposed.
I see. Okay. All right. Are there any other questions then having to do with IT? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor and Council, the next budget is the executive budget, and so as Michael gets that presentation there, this budget is one of the two smaller budgets within the department. At all those funding, we had to start at the beginning. We'll go a ways down there.
Mr. O?
Yes?
John has something.
Yeah, an immediate question. Just in the staff report on the one page and the other, there's the talk of the legal contingency fund.
Yes.
And it describes it as $235,000 in the 2011 budget. And then under the next page over, it talks about no contribution to the legal contingency fund and a reduction of $135,000 from the 2011 budget.
Yep.
Which is the correct number, or did the $100,000 get squirreled away somewhere else? The difference.
Well, we never try to squirrel money away from you council members, so we haven't squirreled anything away. So I'll get to that to make that presentation.
Okay.
Whoa, whoa, slow down. Wow, that was it. That was the executive presentation if you just saw it on the screen. So if you have any questions, I'll move on to the next item.
That was really nice.
Out of curiosity, who's the acting mayor this year? Is that Jim?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I believe so.
Why are you planning on running away? Or?
Well, I actually was going to go get a soda, so if something comes up.
You know, actually, I could use a short break, too.
What? Do we want a short break?
Really?
It would have to be short.
This is
Very short. Otherwise, I'll... You want me to grab you a soda?
Yes, if you could do that, that'd be great. Okay.
Whatever you get.
Dr. Pepper?
Yeah, good.
okay. Back to the overhead. Executive. Now, the executive department, we'll go through this quickly, is the department for the city manager. And when someone brings up that we have two city managers, you actually only have 1.4 that you're paying for. So I have 40% of my time as the assistant city manager. The HR coordinator is Terry. City attorney Alan Cantrud is in this department. Sarah and Chuck Bethel. Our 2012 request, which council, just to be clear how we're working on this, you will hear from each of the departments about what their request is, and then city manager Anton and myself and Gail made a recommendation for cuts. So in this case, you will see a request and then a recommendation for a reduction. And so if you approve the reduction that's being recommended, the request amount will go down by the amount of the reduction. So if that makes sense. The administrative department is proposed to be decreased by about $5,000, or about 1.4%. Our legal division, which is Mr. Cantrud's area, a reduction to 17%. But this is kind of goes into the area and the question that Mr. Nephew asked about the legal contingencies. This is where we typically set money aside and had expenditures in this side for claims, because we've been able to reduce our liability, or our what's the word I'm looking for? Our deductible from $100,000 to $50,000. There's a $50,000 built-in savings right in this department, so that's being realized, and a $50,000 reduction is being shown. So that's the savings in the legal division. The safety program is seeing an $800 increase, but certainly a small program. We do most of this internally with staff, where in past years we spent up to $30,000 to bring outside consultant in. We now do that with our own staff. Human resources is staying exactly the same at $267 in our request, and then we're asking for, we had zero money for the Economic Development Authority. We would like $3,200 to do some of the internal work and start marketing some of our properties and some business interests. So this overall department is requested at $899,620. That's nearly a 6% decrease in the overall department. We'll talk about a couple of the things in the department. What are the trends in this department? In 2008, this department had $915,000 worth of expenditures. 278 of that was paid out in judgments. So you'll see the number goes down dramatically in '09. We didn't have those kinds of judgment payments. And so when we talk about the need to, get that deductible down, this is where we save that money. The amount went up slightly in 10. In 11, our estimate for this year, we propose to put $235,000 into what's called the legal fund, or the legal contingency fund. That includes the $100,000 from the legal department, but also we made a contribution into legal contingencies, and that money is still sitting there. As you know, we haven't finalized all of that, but that is money available for you, sitting in a fund. Our suggestion in this budget is to leave that money to see how legal issues proceed over the years, but you have $135,000 sitting in a fund that's undesignated at this point in time. We're not proposing to put any money into that account, so we've reduced that to $899 this year. Our major expenses in the executive department, one, are Mr. Cantrud. He's a contractual city attorney prosecutor. The proposal is $210,000 expenditure this year. That's approximately a $10,000 increase over what we paid over the past year for some of the expenses for his staff internally. We're talking Mr. Bethel, the HR attorney, and so when we talk about reductions and shifts, Mr. Bethel this year is contracted for about $80,000 per year. We're proposing to reduce him to $50,000 a year in this particular department, so our $899 request would go down by about $25,000 in this case with some contingencies. But Mr. Bethel currently offices with us 2 days a week and then is on a retainer. But we're proposing that for the first 7 to 8 months of 2012 that he be here only 1 day per week, and then because next year will be a contractual negotiation year, he's very valuable in that service, that he would then for the last 4 months of the year provide us 2 day a week service and work with us on our contract. So when we're talking about shifts and budget cuts, this proposed budget is proposed to be reduced by $30,000. In addition, the legal contingency of $235,000, we're proposing to cut that to $100,000, and so that would be money that you would have sitting available for judgments during the year. I gave you some trends, typically somewhere as high as $278,000 and much higher in '07, down to some years it's about $60,000 for various claims and items, but again, money sitting in that account. So our recommendation for this department is to reduce the request by $24,210, and that's what's shown on page 10. With that, I won't go through all the trends and other areas. Simply ask questions or answer questions that council might have on the executive department.
Does anyone have any questions? Now you can go right to page 10.
We will go to the legislative department. Council, this is your department. This is the city council budget with the various commissions. And our 2012 request for you, the city council, is for your budget to increase by about $6,300. We're proposing council salaries to increase at 1%. Consistent with the other employees at the city and their cost of living. The BEDC sees a huge increase, but again, funding for the Economic Development Authority and BEDC, we're seeing about a $6,500 or a $6,200 increase for them to start doing the various work within the BEDC category. Police Civil Service Commission remains the same. Park and Recreation Commission sees a $70 increase. They don't spend much during the year. Planning Commission would continue at $1,000. Most of that is for the tour we were proposing to do. The Human Rights Commission seen a $500 expenditure. Charitable gambling's also within here. We have a balance available. We're not seeing any new revenues, but we're proposing a $5,000 increase to simply begin spending down the balance. So this department, the legislative department, is a $200,000 request. That's a 9.5% increase. And again, noting the increases. 9.5% sounds like a lot, but $6,200 for Betsy, $6,300 for the council, and $5,000 for charitable gambling is a $17,000 increase in this particular department. The legislative department, the trends, as you can see, are fairly consistent. 153 in 08, 143 in 09, 144 in 10, 159 this year, and 171. The increases being in charitable gambling and council expenditures. Our major expenditure, again, is subscriptions and memberships for you as a council. Original amount was $40,000. We're proposing to cut that by $5,000 out of the original request. Second is miscellaneous studies and consultants. Typically, council, that's money for you to do various studies, hire people that if you have initiatives during the year. So we have an allocation of $25,000. We're proposing to reduce that to $21,150. Would also know, council, this is a question that you bring up every year. Our council travel and training budget is $15,000. In the past, you've divided that up equally. You each have an allocation of $3,000. We're not proposing to change that.
Mr. All?
So our recommendation then, $8,850 in reductions to reduce the overall request to $163.
Marv?
The charitable gambling, what exactly is that?
Mayor and Council, the charitable gambling is money that we take in, bring in from charges from anybody that does gambling within the city. We get a percentage, I don't remember the exact percentage that we
10%.
get. I think it's 10%. And we get that money, and then you as a council pick the various agencies that you distribute the money to.
But I didn't understand, but what's that? You said that you have a balance of $30,000?
Mayor and Council, over the years, simply because of cash flow, we've kept about $25,000 to $30,000 in the charitable gambling fund. It's a separate fund from the general fund. So that account has a running balance. And so rather than use it for cash flow, we'd simply cash flow it during the year. Most of the expenditures come out after we get the money anyway. So we're able to reduce the cash flow out of there and reduce the balance and still end the year with a positive balance.
Thank you.
No, Council. This is, again, only charitable gambling funds would go in and go out. It's just that rather than hold a balance, we're proposing that we spend down some of the balance. If there's no questions on the list.
Well, actually, I just want to make sure I understand. So, if you were on page 10, it says 8,850 reduction. And so I'm missing that where that's happening because this looks like a 9.5% increase.
Mayor and Council, again, sorry for the confusion. Two different terms. When the departments come forward, they're going to tell you what their request was, and so that's what the department says needs. The department needs. So, in the legislative department, we came forward with a request of, and I'll highlight it here on the screen, $171,580. However, in our meetings with Mr. Antonin, myself, and Gail, the finance manager, in order to meet your overall goals, we had to identify the reductions throughout the department. So the shifts in money, we are recommending $8,850 in reductions. So on one hand, Chuck All is making a request for $171,000. Chuck All is also recommending you reduce that down to $163,000. So I have to wear two hats. So so our recommendation for that budget would be to cut the $8,850, which, if you do the math, that department then would be funded at $163,000. If you choose to cut more, obviously the $850, you would cut more. If you don't want to make that cut, then the overall request would be met.
Well, and so at what point along the way, when we have this type of thing occurring, do we understand, when we make that cut, how that actually affects where the money's going within the department?
Mayor and Council, hopefully within the intent is for these budget presentations to tell you, in for instance, the Executive Department, if you approve the $24,210 cut, that means that Mr. Bethel will go from 2 days a week to 1.5 days a week.
Well, so that I understood. But so in the Legislative Department, am I missing something? Does it say where the cuts will be? If
yes. We just, under the major expenditures, the cuts will be from subscriptions and memberships. We'll reduce that from 40,000 to 35. Okay. That's 5 of it. And out of the miscellaneous studies budget, consultant budget, we'll be reducing that from 25,000 to 21,150. That's the additional 3,850. So between the two of those adds up to $8,850 reduction.
Okay. Sorry, I missed those.
No, I understand. There's a lot of numbers running around.
All right. John.
What subscriptions and memberships would we be cutting?
Jim, we talked to a couple of them that you had the list of various subscriptions that you work through.
I think we're keeping the, we're not actually, I think there was I think the 40,000 was more generous than the actual subscriptions that we had. So I was looking at the National League of Cities, but I felt that it was like was it to between $2,000 and $3,000, and we didn't go this year, but I'm hoping that perhaps next year the mayor and a council member or so would take advantage of that. So we're not actually, we reduced the total amount, but I don't believe it affected any of the current subscriptions that we have. And again, a portion of it was on your studies and stuff like that. We hadn't used all that money over the years.
If we did actually want to reduce something, which I'm assuming we're paying for, but I'm not going to be attending the Regional Mayors Association.
I think that's absolutely minimal. I think it was, I don't remember the exact amount, but I don't think I budgeted for that.
All right. I just can't go to downtown Minneapolis in the middle of the day. So.
And there's a lot of mayors that can't. The mayors that work for a living usually can't make those meetings.
All those other ones that apparently are independently wealthy.
I'm not saying anything.
Okay. Any other questions having to do with that? Not? Go ahead, Chuck.
There we go. If there are no other questions, that's the legislative. Our last department that we'll talk about is community development. And in the community development, I currently am serving as your community development director. So when you talk about 40% of my time for assistant city manager, the rest of my time goes in finance and community development and public works. So we also have Dave Fisher, our building official, 3 planners, Sean, Tom, and Mike, who you see regularly at the meetings. Our assistant building officials, Nick Carver. We also have 2 building inspectors, our environmental health officer, Molly, and our senior administrative assistant. Our 2012 request in the administrative division is a $275,000 request for a 2.6% increase simply in some of the wages. Planning is a $250,000 expenditure for our planners. That's 5.1%, simply some shifting of time and expenditures. Our building inspections department is $480,000. That's a 7.8%. Again, you'll see on the next line item, public health inspections is being seen a decrease, and the next item, code enforcement. These three items, the same people work these three items: building inspections, public health, and code enforcement. So overall, we're not proposing any changes. We're simply just reallocating time. Instead of, right now we have Dave Fisher doing a lot of our code enforcement. He's our highest paid individual in the department. We may start shifting some of our duties and have some of the other inspectors help out. Molly's getting into more of the code enforcement areas. It's simply a better use of time and a reallocation. We're not cutting any hours or enforcement time in code enforcement. We're simply reallocating people. The recycling program, seeing just a leveling out, slight decrease. Again, we don't anticipate having the large expenditure for the budget for the consultants this year. And we're adding a new program. It's not a new program, it's simply a shift. We currently had all of our environmental planning done out of what's called the storm sewer maintenance budget. So we have environmental planning, and that's what Sean does. A lot of the Ginny and Ann Hutchinson, and a lot of the work that's done for our planning, and we'll simply start tracking that out of community development rather than run that through public works. So while the budget is $2.06 million, that's a 14.1% increase. However, with the shift, taken out, the environmental planning is simply a shift out of one department. If you take that out, we have only a 0.3% decrease in this department. So in effect, no change in the expenditures in this department. When we talk about the trends in this department, though, the key thing, pointing this out, I'll move through this quickly, just recognize the numbers. In 2008, we had $1.68 million. In 2009, almost the exact same budget, 1.69. In 2010, we had a slight decrease of 1.6. We increased to 1.8, but we had a $158,000 increase in recycling. So if you take that out of there, again, we're back to the same expenditures for those years. And in 2012, there's the 2.6, but really 1.08. So the point of this whole chart, the reason I show you, is that our expenditures for this department have remained steady for the last 5 years. However, this department, prior to 2008, did not really require money from the general fund and tax dollars because the building permit revenues, they were self-sustaining. In 2008, that number had dropped from a high in 2006 of $1.5 million to $1.08 million worth of building permit revenue. In 2009, that number went down to $874,000. In 2010, it went down to $794,000. That's a $300,000 loss in money while the department expenditures remained steady. In 2011, this year, we're estimating just over $801,000. We're barely on track to make that, even with the new building permits that have been coming in, so we're barely going to make that number. And next year, we're only estimating $825,000. Council, this is one of the departments that's changed because we've gone from a growth city to a maintenance city. And we're no longer able to support our building inspectors and planners by the fees that are collected. This is a very busy department, though. This is not what's there, but we've gone from inspecting new buildings to doing code enforcement work and finding permits and other issues. There's a cost of doing that, and certainly this is one of the departments that really, over the last 5 years, showed a major shift. And I think these numbers show you that literally it's a $750,000 shift from a department that made a contribution to the general fund, kept taxes down, to an expenditure you now have to make for the department. With that, our community development department, our major expenses it's 85% personnel. We certainly don't have a lot of outside expenses, almost all personnel. So when we start cutting this department, we have to cut people. Our recycling contract is a major expense at $470,000. Now, the reductions recommended. Well, we recommended $2.06 million. We're recommending $49,000 worth of reductions. One is as we start reassigning people. We're proposing to reassign Nick Carver. He's done presentations to you about the Green Building Code. We think that 20% of his time should come out of that environmental planning. That means his salary would be paid for out of the fees for the stormwater utility and the environmental utility fund instead of out of the general fund. Saves us $23,000. Some miscellaneous expenditures. We had money in the budget for consultants to do land use planning. We don't need that. Our land use plan is up to date. We don't need to do that, and so this is that expenditure cut. In addition, this is a nice way of saying we have some administrative and salary expenses. We may have some people retiring. We may not replace that, but rather than talk directly about people and positions, we have some part-time people that we might have to look at during the middle of the year next year, and I'd rather not get into any specifics about people, but our administrative and salary sides, we might have to have about $11,000 reduction in some of the reorganization in this department. So our recommendation is to cut $49,860,000. We think that those expenditures are reasonable, and we recommend it to you. So any questions on the Community Development Department?
Kathy?
This isn't actually a question about the money itself, but at some point when we're doing staff-type articles in the City News, I think it would behoove us to do something about the change in community development and get pretty elementary, if you will. Because I think the term community development implies that, you know, if they're not planning a new building, they're not doing anything. And so I think we all need to be re-educated to when you're a redeveloping community and an aging community, those same people, first of all, are versatile enough and educated enough to do what needs to be done, but what we're assigning them to do needs to change in some ways. So I think it would help everybody to know what exactly that change is about.
Mayor and Council, Ms. Judeman, thank you for those comments. I think that's very important. I kind of tried to allude that to on page 44, 5A. I don't know if you caught that. I know there's a lot of information, but just kind of the vision of where this department's going. That's really not my task as kind of a part-time community development director, but if you had a, you know, I hate to use her name, Melinda Coleman or somebody like that who's got a vision for a department, this really has to change. We've gone from a department that responded to new plats, new buildings, to now we're redevelopment, environmental, energy, really a code enforcement type of department. And so your new director eventually is going to have to take that department in that direction and really that environmental leadership role from what we used to be as a growth community. We're not going to have growth. But those redevelopment initiatives that take so much time and effort, that's really where we have to go. And as we transition into that, your economic development, your BEDC Commission, that's really the department and really where it needs to go.
John?
A question about the Environmental Utility Fund and the suggestion of the 20% of the assistant building official for environmental planning. I guess the first question is what limitations really exist on how the EUF can be used, assuming, I mean, a certain portion of green building code has to do with stormwater management and stuff like that. So I'm looking for information on that, and then I guess from the council standpoint, I see sort of a policy question here, assuming that it passes muster as far as being a thing that we have the power to do. I'm not sure how comfortable I am with increasing the amount of operating expenses that go to things that might be a little bit more peripheral on the use of the EUF. And the reason really is because it's a pretty regressive form of raising revenue. I mean, it's essentially a per household, in effect, it's a per household tax in most cases. I mean, there are differences for how it's calculated on some properties, but for the typical homeowner. And I know that we've been increasing it over the years, and understandably, because there's been limits to what we've been comfortable doing with our property taxes and so forth. But I'm worried about going too far down a road, especially given how much really we need the fund for so many things as far as our environmental quality mandates that we have to live up to. So the first question is, are we comfortable with that from a standpoint of what the EUF is supposed to be for, from a strictly legal standpoint, if there are any limitations like that? And then the other question is, are we as a council comfortable with that as the way that we want to be funding this? Not questioning whether it should be funded, but just is that the best way to do it?
Mayor and Council, the Environmental Utility Fund, clearly it's a term we use to call it, but your authority is a stormwater utility. And so it clearly has to be stormwater related. One of the things that's happening, Bill Prefer is retiring, and so as the dominoes fall, that's a position we're not going to replace. Well, Bill does a lot of the recycling work. And so what we're doing is taking Sean, who does a lot of the environmental planning, and saying, Sean, take your portion of your time, move it over and pick up more of the recycling duties that Bill used to do. Well, that leaves a void for the environmental planning side, and we're saying Nick Carver needs to go in there. He simply can't do things like energy things or those. It has to be stormwater related. And so when we charge that to the Environmental Utility Fund, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Nick Carver picking up some of the duties that Sean has done in the past. So that's a shift, and you're absolutely right. From you as a council, the Environmental Utility Fund fee is something that we've projected is going to have to continue to grow in the 5 to 10% range for about 3 more years. And that's to cover our expenditures. We limit our environmental planning to 25% of that charge or less. 75% goes to either building pipes or cleaning pipes or sweeping streets or all the other works. And so we have a quote internal policy that 25% education, 75% pipes and work and real construction. And so that continues to remain the same. That's really why we're creating the environmental planning program, so that you can see what that program does and get the actual work measurements out of that and say, okay, we don't want to have 50% of that simply going to the planning side and education. We simply want to keep it at 25%. So we're trying to keep on top of that, but it's that huge change that we've seen started a few years ago, but really got dramatic over the last 5 years of the need for rain gardens and education and turning that back in order to meet that. That educational component is really becoming a major expenditure. But I would absolutely agree. If you're not prepared to increase the environmental utility fee by the 5 to 10% range over the next 2-3 years, then we need to reconsider that. So
is the funding of Sean's pay then shifting, seeing she's moving out of that?
Well, part of it.
Yes, Mayor and Council, definitely. Right now, Sean's pay is, I could look it up, just rough numbers, about 75% environmental utility, 25% recycling. With Bill being paid out of the recycling fund, his is going to go away, so Sean's pay will go to about 50-50, environmental utility and recycling, and the difference will be made up then by Nick Carver. So we're really not seeing a major increase in our environmental planning expenditures, simply new people going in there. With the retirement of Bill Prefer, we're cutting back on the number of people and just shifting people around.
All right, so just to say that again, in that shifting around that we're doing, we're really not spending that much more money out of our environmental utility fund than we were before?
Mayor and Council, that's correct. We're maintaining the 25%, but we're spending more money simply because the entire pot is going up. It's 25%, but when you raise the overall rates by 10%, that's the increase. And so we're not spending much more slightly. So to say, no, we're not spending any more money, no, we're probably spending a little more money, but not dramatically.
Okay. Kathy?
I just thought I'd point out that we've already made a policy change when we decided to back off on our public works and streets projects, which is where we did a lot of our environmental obligatory activity. So we have to do it somewhere to satisfy our permits, and there is no better place to do it if we are not doing it via the street projects, which also provide a certain amount of education, than to do it with the people who have to do the enforcement / education of the public to help us meet that. So we've already actually made a policy change by doing what we did with our streets projects. So we have to do it somewhere. And in my mind, at least it ties together with the fact that planning is going to have to shift anyway, because we're going to be redeveloping more than developing, and the way to keep up with your environmental issues / obligations is in actually the planning stage. We just couldn't do it when we had old stuff, but if we're starting over, we have to have somewhere where people can be guided by that. So I think we're doing a required by the convention of the world shift and still meeting our obligations. At least that's how I interpret it.
Yes, John?
Well, and I in no way would disagree with the position being funded or the work being done. It has more to do, in my mind, with the EUF dollars and precisely those other needs. I mean, for example, the flooding issues that we were talking about, and the potential of needing to fund repairs on storm sewer things outside of the street construction program and so forth, and whether we should be relying so much on the EUF for some of these non-capital expenditures in meeting those requirements. But I think that the point, Mr. All, that you make and that we'll repeat it, is that this is just shifting the same dollars, and so it's not really a change. It's just which paycheck the fund is being channeled into according to the duties shifting.
Are there other questions? Well, I'm sure that we've all been referring as we go to page 10. And I actually, in the process of tonight, actually figured out how it should be working, because at one point with the IT department, I made a note that said that we have to add $10,000 to IT, but we don't, because that is already up here in this number. And so unless we're adding to it or reducing it, so that's why it's not listed there. And so I've just figured that out a little while back.
Page 10 off on the four action.
Have we covered everything? Nobody else has any questions? I don't see any reason then we're sitting here. We should probably go home. So at 10:07 we're adjourned. 8:07. No, 10, yeah. I was looking, I was going to say 10 after 8. All right, so it's 8:07.
10:07, you'll have to say for yourself. I am not saying another 2 hours.
Thank you.
Minnesota's Twin Cities are home to hundreds of thousands of vehicles, acres of concrete and asphalt, nearly 3 million people, and one national park.
I read someplace that if you leave stuff like televisions and computers plugged in, even if you turn them off, they keep using energy. I'd always looked at that whole on-off issue as an either-or thing. In an often irrational world, those kinds of absolutes are comforting. That's when I got one of these, a power strip. One button virtually unplugs my precious yet energy-sucking lifestyle amenities. And once again, I live in a rational universe where off absolutely means off.